Hey, what's up, you guys? This is a strange place to be filming your video for the week, but I just got finished teaching a yoga class, and I did not have time during the regular work hours to get your video filmed. And so there's actually some people at my house right now. I've got guests over for dinner, and I didn't really want to go in there and say, you guys be quiet, I gotta film this video. So I pulled in my driveway and I was like, I'm just gonna film it here before I go inside and start getting distracted by all the people. So I wanted to talk to you guys about the podcast that I asked you to read, S-Town, or ask you to listen to, I guess. So I want to say a few things about why I picked that podcast, and I want to give you a few of my thoughts in addition to getting you ready to complete the discussion board assignment for this week. So I guess the first thing I want to talk about is why I picked it. So I listened to this podcast for the first time right when it came out. I do like listening to podcasts, and this one was recommended to me because I had a friend who knew that I was really interested in Southern literature. And so they were like, I think you'll really be interested in hearing this guy's story. And when I listened to it, absolutely could not stop listening to it. I only assigned the first 2 episodes for you guys in case it's not something you're interested in. But I couldn't stop and devoured the story and found it fascinating to hear someone who lives in a place that's similar to where I'm from, but who really hates that environment. John B. McLemore hated his town. So it's just an interesting, I guess, negative perspective in some ways, but also real. Sometimes we want to just listen to the good stories that people have, and I'm guilty of that too, really wanting to watch stuff with happy endings. But this story isn't happy. At the end of that second episode, he ends up killing himself. John McLemore does. And, it's really sad, but it happened. And I think we should consider, why was his story so tragic? What drove him to being so sad? And I think part of it's his environment. Of course, part of it's his personality. Maybe he has this disposition towards being negative. But I think a lot of what makes him so sad is his environment. So that's one reason. I guess I wanted to provide a counter sort of negative example. S-Town stands for shit town. I don't think about Carrollton as shit town, but John B. McLemore might have. So I'm just curious about why. The other reason that I picked this particular podcast is I'm interested in its format. So in this class, you have a final research paper where I'm asking you to interview someone who lives in the South. And that's what this is. Now, obviously, you're not making a podcast out of it. You don't have the time that Brian had, the guy who's interviewing him. You're not gonna have the time to make that big of a project. But I'm inspired by his work. I'm inspired by him going and being on the ground with John B. McLemore and trying to understand his story, because his story is so different than Brian's life, who he lives in New York or something, I think he says. He's not from the South. So it's from an outside perspective. You're probably also not gonna have a character that's as interesting as John B. McLemore, to be honest, that you're gonna interview. But that's okay. Again, this is just the inspiration for the work. Just talking to somebody and understanding where they're coming from. That's what I think this podcast does. And that's what you're going to end up doing in this class too at the end. So that's sort of my reason. Now, the questions I ask myself when I think about this podcast, and I've listened to it 3 times now because I listened to it for fun, and this is my second time teaching it. And the questions I ask myself every time are, what does John want us to know about S-Town? What does he want us to understand? He calls someone that he wants Brian to make a story. What does he want to be told, about his town? If you come to class tomorrow, we'll talk about that. What story does he want to be told? But I want you just to think about it on your own too. And then another question I have is, if it's such a shit town, why doesn't he leave? If it's so bad and he's that miserable, there are other places you can live, So what makes him insist on staying? What drives him to stay? I don't really want to ask why does he kill himself necessarily, because I think it's way too complicated for us to understand. We're not psychologists, and that is so complex and deep and dark that I don't really want to ask that. But I am curious. I think the best way to think about that is, what is so bad about his town? What is so awful for him personally? And that's really what I'm left with. What was so awful, and why doesn't he leave if it's so bad? Now, those are all the philosophical questions that this text brings to my mind when I think about the South. And next class period, we're watching something much lighter. We're watching Sweet Home Alabama, which is the total opposite. Sweet Home or Shit Town. Both of them are about Alabama, which I know isn't Georgia, but it's close enough, right? Two very different perspectives of this place. And why do some people find it their home, and why do some people have to run from it, you know? Those, again, philosophical questions, but here's how I'm going to have you analyze this text today for your discussion board. So you'll see the instructions. I've got them typed out on this discussion board that you're on right now to watch this video. But here's what I'm going to have you to do. We may or may not have talked about the idea of tropes if you were present in class or if you've looked at all the discussion boards. But there's one way that I really like to think about analyzing things, and it's through noticing patterns. I noticed, I quote Thomas Foster, he's like a big literary person in this discussion board, and he talks about the way that we read things is through a pattern of significance. So you might think about the idea of a trope or a pattern as like kind of like a theme or something that you see present in the text, in any text. And it can be, you know, something that you see in a single text or something that you see across lots of things. So for example, I always say, no matter what you're looking at, a book, a movie, piece of art, it's pretty much almost always about identity. And I call that a trope. That's something that is, someone's trying to express something about their identity always. So I include that as a trope every time. Another one that I always include is culture. Every text that you read is representative of a culture of people who live in Alabama, a culture of people who are Americans, a culture of people who are women, a culture of people who are fill in the blank, farmers. I mean, anything that's a group of people with similar values, you can have a culture or a community. So those are some easy tropes to identify, but some of them are more complex, like violence, or I always like to think about names, like how are names significant? Like what is the meaning behind a person's relationship to nature or something like that? So sometimes the tropes I think are harder to think about, and that's why I have a list of common ones on this discussion board. Like these are common topics that literature, art, music, history, society is interested in discussing. So I've made a list of them here. And you'll see that if you scroll down. What I want you to do is pick one of those tropes, any of them, that you think you see present in this podcast. Any of them. Anything that you see and you're like, I feel like this podcast deals with that idea. Pick it. That's your T for your TDQA. The second thing I want you to pick is a corresponding detail that shows the presence of that trope. So let's say you pick motherhood. Let's say you are interested in John's relationship to his mom. Your detail would be a very specific moment that you think is important, that has to do with the relationship that they have. So it's a very, very specific piece of evidence. That's a detail. The second part, or they kind of go together, the Q and the A. What you're going to ask as a question is often, you could think about it in a couple ways. Why does whoever make that action? So if John says something about his mom, you can ask, why did John say that? What does that tell us about his relationship with her? What does that signify about how he thinks about parenthood or something like that? You can think, why did John or whoever say that? Another question you can always ask for this analytical work is, why did the director, Brian in this case, include that? So if you think about this, Brian as the interviewer has so much material, like more than we hear. You know what I mean? Like he does way more interviews than he can include in this podcast, without a doubt. So he's very particular about what gets included. So if you hear something that seems significant to you, not only could you ask yourself, why did the character, John or his mother or whoever, say that thing, but then why did Brian include it? All of your A answers are your analytical points that try to understand this idea a little bit more, I mean, largely. Like, what could that possibly mean? Remember, you're just trying to make your best guess here. You're not in these people's minds. You don't know what's going on, but you're just trying to empathize and think about it. I did an example with Honey Boo Boo. If you were in the first day of class, we watched a clip from Honey Boo Boo, so I thought it might help if you could see how I would do this exact exercise with that clip. Just to kind of see what I'm looking for. I think that'll help if you can kind of visualize it that way. But that's all I'm asking you to do for this discussion post. Think about those large questions, like a discussion question of what's so bad about this place and why doesn't he leave, and then follow that TDQA exercise. So it's Monday night. I wish I had this posted earlier, but I'll get this posted in the next hour or so. I gotta eat some dinner first, I'm tired. But then I'm gonna get all this posted. You'll be ready to go for tomorrow. So you can see this. If you come to class, we're doing this exact same conversation, just in person. So, all right, I look forward to reading what you have to say this week about S-Town. Let me know what you thought about it, and we'll talk again soon.